told you, dear, I'm a I don't like these people, never will do.
Do you want the British race to survive, or do you want this country to become occupied by a load of khaki-coloured multiracial...
I think we were all there, being stabbed, being beaten up, being chased. So that myth of the passive intimidation is now going to be smashed.
It was about time we did something for ourselves.
Let's talk about racism against Indians. But let's be real. When people say they hate Indians, they mean they hate anyone who kind of looks like us.
Your family is from India. You have no respect. You have no roles. You think you can push everyone, push. That's what you think you are. You guys are crazy.
Indian people are crazy. You told me to have some more curry, right?
Yeah, here.
Have some more curry. My tandoori.
Yeah, you're tender.
Wow.
You're racist towards me. I'm American.
So are we.
You're not American.
No? Not American?
Not originally, no. You're
I was born in America.
No, you weren't.
Yes, I
saw your
was.
passport.
Yeah, you want to see my passport? Is that a guy gonna make you help me?
Which means it affects all South Asians. So this is really a video about the universal dislike, disgust, and hatred directed at South Asian folks. Hi, it's Rohan, and I'm filming this from Kerala, India today, hence the change in scenery. The othering of people from this region is not new. It's been around for 1,000 years, and it's just taken different forms as time has passed. And to be frank, we are often gaslit online in today's modern world to believe that we, for one reason or another, deserve the racism and hatred. US media in particular teaches people to make broad sweeping assumptions like how South Asian people are not capable of defending themselves or standing up for themselves, that we might be less threatening in some sort of way.
A group of white youths set up on me and they had beaten me unconscious.
Has become an everyday occurrence in the East End.
We have at the moment 2/3 coloured population. Don't you think we have enough?
White youths, encouraged by the National Front, went on the rampage.
These shops were broken by bottles.
All these skinheads swearing, shouting, and throw these stones, break my all windows. There's the trick.
I tried to go inside the shop, but by then they started throwing bottles at us. And then 3 or 4 of them punched me, one after another.
And almost always undesirable. Now, like all communities, we have our own problems. We know that. I mean, we're usually the only ones actually talking about it, unpacking it, and trying to discard generational trauma through discussion and self-exploration.
Happy holidays. I'm Tracy Vadakumcheri, and I'm a licensed therapist in New York, California, and Florida. I'm also Indian American, and I work with a lot of South Asian Americans who struggle with toxic guilt and toxic shame. We don't see ourselves authentically represented in Western mainstream media. Often when we are represented, we either have to fit in to some kind of Western norm. As a result, a lot of us get accused of being whitewashed. And then there are those of us who feel like we have to appropriate Black culture just to fit in and prove that we're not whitewashed. But then when we take up space as our authentic selves, we feel intense amounts of shame. And that's because for a lot of us growing up, we were picked on for being too Indian. We have been conditioned to feel ashamed about the traditions and the cultural traits that are authentically unique to us. So when I saw us perform during those couple of seconds at the Macy's Thanksgiving parade, I noticed that my initial reaction was shame. Because I knew there had to have been some white or non-South Asian person in the audience or somebody watching this on television who is likely going to make an offensive comment about how different we are. It's crazy how much we have internalized the Western gaze for our own protection and survival. It's also brought up some very complicated feelings for me as well, as somebody who is Indian but not Hindu, and how often the people who get to represent us are the ones who often fit a stereotype of what people think we should be. Those of us who confuse the Western mindset more often don't get a platform. Like for those of us who are not Indian but Hindu, for example, or those of us who are Indian but not Hindu, or those of us who are not necessarily North Indian.
When people outside the community try to speak about South Asian issues, a lot of the times you get the feeling that our trauma is used as racial cudgels to further enact some sort of discrimination and perpetuate broad sweeping assumptions about us. The benefit of the doubt and political nuance is not something that's extended to the perpetual alien, the perennial foreigner. It is politically convenient in many white supremacist nations to view brown people as somehow a barbaric and regressive, but also a servile monolith. There is a defanging and erasure of our histories of resistance, struggle, and progress. To the point where when something as massive as the youth uprising in Bangladesh happens, people don't make the connection or the long history of anti-colonial struggles and anti-racist struggles by brown people. Many people still don't want to make that connection and allow themselves to challenge their assumptions about us. This disconnection from the actual producers who reside in the resource-rich and oftentimes very lush regions of the global south, from the consumers of the so-called global north, is not a coincidence. Let's spend some time on the words South Asian or Asian. We must remember that in the context of Western countries like Canada, US, Australia, and so on, these terms are just created to denote those who are not white. These are broad, sweeping, general terms that would encapsulate a Kashmiri, a Tamil, a Kuki, a Siddhi, and beyond the colonizer-made borders of India and Pakistan. It also encapsulates Baloch people, Sri Lankan people, people from Nepal, Bangladesh, and even the Rohingya. Anyone who's taken a real interest in the region knows how diverse it is and knows how interconnected it is beyond these colonizer-set boundaries. However, let me tell you, I don't think there's any point in explaining our nuances to people who do not even view us as human. The reality is, like, we can scream and shout and yell all we want for nuance from white Western governments. It makes no difference what flavor of brown you are to a white supremacist with a gun. And that, kids, is why we need to be thinking about addition and not subtraction. So who gets to be Asian? The term Asian in the US refers to East Asians. But in the UK, the word Asian refers to brown Asians from the subcontinent. So to simplify my points, I need to pick one. So I'm just going to pick South Asian. And before I go ahead, I know that when South Asians talk about their struggles, there's always people in the comments or people online shining a torchlight on our issues, our inter-community issues. We know. Again, the only people really addressing those internal issues are other South Asians. We know that anti-blackness and colorism is a known problem in, dare I say, most South Asian communities. Thanks to an intersection of failed homegrown caste structures intersecting with white European standards. Anti-blackness is universal. Watch Kara's video on anti-blackness and colorism if you're interested, or even Foreign Man in a Foreign Land's video on anti-blackness in the Indian community. And if you have any questions about caste, please watch my video on caste after this if you haven't already. There has been an undeniable erasure and invisibilization of South Asians and South Asian perspectives in Western media, i.e. world media. And Western media is world media. I mean, I haven't done a count of this specifically, but I'm willing to bet that there are more sympathetic portrayals of ex-Confederate soldiers or genocidal white dudes than there are portrayals of just everyday brown people just going about their lives or doing some, I don't know, mundane tasks or having a mundane life, or being an action hero without racial stereotypes from an American lens or just straight up brown face.
Question is not who I am, the question is who are you? I know who I am. I am Prince Lalejama from the Ringy-Dingy Heights near Bombay, Calcutta and New Delhi, India, 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 India.
Which means a lot of also South Asians born in the West may not be aware of South Asian culture or history. Many still assume that South Asia is a mass of monolithic brown people who look and sound like Apu, when in reality it is more diverse than you can possibly fathom. The region consists of 25% of the world's population, yet the world seems to not know anything about it. And a lot of people who do learn about South Asia and South Asians online don't learn it through a South Asian lens or a voice. They'd rather have it fed to them through the lens of usually a white male travel vlogger who exploits poor people for views so that their audience can validate their racism back home. Or they learn about South Asia through a movie tinged in yellow or brown, usually in which a white guy protagonist has to fight a South Asian crime boss to save the browns from themselves. And people just take this perspective completely unseasoned, which is to say, without a spoonful of salt. Extraction is a cool movie, by the way. Cool visuals, cool action, all that. Nice popcorn flick, but it's still a generic yellow-filtered, evil, dirty, scary, foreign fantasy for white people that South Asians, unfortunately, have come to expect from US media. And South Asian movie industries have their problems too, but this ain't that video. I mean, if you at least had a South Asian person write it and direct it and act in it, you'd at least get a different lens. Perhaps merely a toes dip into the ideas of stratification in South Asian societies, a caste even, and our unique perspective.
Last time I saw you, you were giving yoga lessons. Look at you now. You're running an empire.
God has been kind to me.
What is all this rubbish I hear about you supporting the Saffron Party?
आदेश जोशी ने संकल्प लिया है. He will do great things for Yathana.
He promised you land, didn't he? That mother chode. I run the construction sites. We're not a bunch of farmers you can step on.
But your power lies in bullets and mine. These beats. A gangster controls people with fear. I invite them into the light, and willingly they come.
तुझे क्या लगा? तू हमें रोक पाएगा?
Those who say religion has nothing to do with politics don't understand religion at all.
Thank you, Dev Patel. I accept. All this being said, I'm not interested in misery porn or infantilizing our people and painting them as some kind of perfect little victims. Instead, let's talk about some criminally underrated and criminally underexplored parts of our history, episodes of actual resistance, stories of actual solidarity between communities, between brown and black communities, brown and black solidarity that you most definitely have not learned about in school or in most movies. It's 1976, Dominion Theatre, Southall. Gurdeep Singh Chagar, an 18-year-old schoolboy, had just been stabbed. I know, puppy. He was fatally wounded, and when a passerby asked a police officer who it was, the police just responded, "Just an Asian." Gurdeep certainly wasn't the first South Asian in the UK to be murdered for just being South Asian, but the impact of his death, combined with the rising normalization of anti-immigrant and specifically anti-South Asian rhetoric by the British state as well, sparked a new generation of South Asians to organize their own defense. South Asian workers groups such as the Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Kashmiri workers organizations had already existed in the UK. However, their focus was on the politics of the homeland. It was about competing nationalities and tending to old wounds passed on through their fathers, rather than their existence as brown people in the land of their former colonizers. The children of those new families soon felt compelled to fight for their rights in their new home through political protest and direct action. Here's a quote from the youth movement in Bradford from their paper Kala Tara in 1979. "We must organize ourselves so that any racist attack can be dealt with effectively. We cannot rely on the police, we must rely on ourselves. Black self-defense is no offense." You will notice in their literature that the South Asian youth in the UK at the time consciously and explicitly identified as black, because they understood that in the eyes of the British state, anyone who wasn't white would be considered the other as black. Furthermore, those black and brown youths existed in a world right after the events of March 21st, 1960, a day in apartheid South Africa where police officers in the black township of Sharpeville opened fire on a group of people peacefully protesting apartheid laws. 69 protesters were killed and the world took notice. The Sharpeville massacre is often cited as the turning point for the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela. The ANC would turn from passive resistance to resistance. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the state of South Africa would go on to deem them a organization. These events sent ripples through marginalized communities in the UK, who banded under the identity of black in solidarity. Many even rejected the labels of brown or colored. This would seem like an alien concept to a lot of people, especially in the US. One, because of the invisibilization of South Asian representation and even stories of solidarity between minorities in general. Two, the active use of the in-between racial identities to be pit against black folks in the US by the state, which in turn keeps minorities divided. And three, the unique demographic of Indian immigration to the US post-1965, which was predominantly privileged caste folks who could access that very restrictive immigration system. Affluent folks who had the resources necessary to make that shift. This is a topic that requires a lot more time, so I'm going to come back to this later in a different video. The truth was that Western nations needed immigrant labor. They needed additional taxpayers to continue growing. However, it became apparent that the labor, culture, and cuisine was the only thing that many people living in these countries wanted. They didn't really want the immigrant laborers themselves.
What a marvelous smell. Reminds me of the Punjab.
Just a little something to tickle your fancy, dear.
By Jove, what a wonderful biryani.
Spicy as the Orient itself, eh?
No.
That's hot stuff, you know.
You're killing me.
Try Vesta's new beef biryani, a rather splendid Indian.
Unless, of course, those immigrants shared everything that was unique about themselves and their identities, and assimilated into the constructed exclusionary idea and identity built to make perfect consumers. Some of you may know what I'm talking about. This is a passage from the Asian Youth Movement's magazine Kala Tara, or Black Star. Page 6 illustrates, 200 years of colonization had already underdeveloped our countries. British colonialism had perverted our economies to its own ends, robbed us of our wealth and independence, left us with a large labor force and no capital with which to make the laborer productive. It was to this army of labor she turned when she was faced with a shortage. Now the British media convinces us that Britain did us a favor by letting us come into this country to improve our lot. Everyone made money on immigrant labor, from big-time capitalists to slum landlords. By exploiting their labor, their color, and their culture, the immigrant worker had cost this country nothing. He had been paid for by the country of his origin, reared and raised as history had shown for the labor markets of Europe. For Britain, the immigrant laborers represented a net saving. The 70s had witnessed a general decline in world capitalism. Britain too had been feeling the symptoms of an economic slump, with nearly 2 million British unemployed. No signs of the recession easing. That's when the "come to Britain, the streets are paved with gold" changed to "the British people are really rather scared of being swamped by people of a different culture."
People are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. We must hold out the prospect of a clear end to immigration.
Many of you may have noticed the exact same pattern being played out in almost every Western nation right now. Canada, for instance, quickly shifted from its immigrant-loving rhetoric and how the nation is accepting to all to now talking about slashing immigration, deporting Indians, and so on.
Hey, so you might have already seen the latest federal immigration cuts announced last week. The federal government is cutting permanent residency spots by 21% in 2025.
Migrant Rights Network is in Ottawa today to demand an end to immigration cuts, systemic exploitation, and racist rhetoric. We held a press conference this morning with our allies from the housing justice movement and refugee service providers, as well as migrant groups, including Immigrant Workers Center and the Postgraduate Workers Committee of the Najwan Support Network. We are doing this the morning of Immigration Minister Miller's presentation to the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration on Canada's 2025 to 2027 immigration levels. These policies will result in over 2.3 million people being expelled over the next 2 years. And by reducing immigration, Prime Minister Trudeau is affirming the racist idea that migrants are responsible for the affordability and housing crises.
Justin Trudeau calling us a tap to turn off and on when he likes. But I'm standing here to say I am a person, I have feelings, I deserve rights. We are the farm workers that feed you. We are not the ones who get the money when the grocery store raises their food prices.
This is a distraction from the policies, laws, and programs that could turn the tide of Canada's housing crisis. Migrants, international students, refugees, temporary foreign workers, and undocumented people are not responsible for Canada's housing, economic, or infrastructure challenges.
The heart of this issue is whether Canada chooses to treat international students and immigrant workers with respect for their labor and contribution to this country's economy, or instead as a disposable item to be used, scapegoated, and discarded.
Il y a seulement 2 ans, ces mêmes personnes migrantes ont été désignées comme les travailleurs-travailleuses essentiels et décrits comme les anges gardiens au Québec. Au bout de 2 années à peine, les discours publics font des personnes migrantes les boucs et misère face à des faillites de politiques publiques comme l'échec du contrôle des prix de logement.
In a shameful abdication of responsibility, the Canadian government has massively reduced its commitment to offer protection to those fleeing persecution and danger in the world, and has further complicated the right to family reunification for refugees in Canada who will remain separate from their spouse and children for years to come.
Migrants aren't taking jobs and homes. We feed the economy, raise it, we grow it. We pay into public services that we are denied access to, like employment insurance and healthcare. Without us, the social welfare net would collapse. Shutting us out will cause a social and economic crisis that no GST holiday can fix.
Instead of looking at why there isn't enough housing in the first place, and maybe even why your dinosaur of an uncle who may have paid 25 grand for his home is now expecting $1 million on his deathbed. Boom, bust, boom, bust. You know the drill. Statistics Canada released a report this year about the rise of hate crimes directed at Indian folks and South Asians in general. Between 2019 and 2022, they found that hate crimes against South Asians rose by 143%. Now keep in mind, these are police-reported hate crimes from complaints made by a community notorious for keeping their issues behind closed doors. South Asian folks are some of the least likely people to even access mental health services in North America. So this rise by 143% is especially noteworthy. Let's see what the stats are in 2026 when we get the data for the last 2 years. This cycle of using and abusing immigrant labor drives many countries' policies, politics, and rhetoric. And too many people in positions of privilege are happy to let it happen without challenge, including other brown folks who've previously benefited from the same systems. At the dining table, at the home, at work, in school, or at home again if you're homeschooled, it's normalized in many households to casually chip away the humanity of South Asian folks in Western countries. In the UK, mere months before Chagar's death, the media flooded the news with headlines like Asians jumping housing queues, 600 immigrants a week, Asian invasion. Attacks on South Asians rose, the privileged kept quiet.
There's been more and more coming to the town. We've set the authorities, please, no more.
All of my friends were either black or Asian, and this caused friction. I remember it causing friction within my family. If you hang around with too many black kids, you're going to get involved in crime. If you hang around with Asian kids, you're going to start eating curry. I mean, it sounds ridiculous considering it's our national cuisine now.
I've got nothing against the coloured people, don't get me wrong, but there's nothing left for the white person in Southall at all. Our white people, they wouldn't demonstrate like the colours are.
Hateful rhetoric by the far-right group, the NF, ramped up.
John Kingsley Reid, a member of the extreme right-wing British National Party, shouted, "One down, 1 million to go."
Coloured element will be repatriated from this country, and pending their repatriation, no. We certainly don't believe they should have the vote. They should be immediately disenfranchised because they're not part of the British people.
On 23rd April 1976, the far-right political group National Front organized a meeting and a march at a local school in Bradford for an organization that has advocated for the deportation of Asians to hold a broadly televised meeting, an election meeting at that, in the heart of a South Asian community, was an attack on the community as a whole. And it sent a message that the state and the police were on the side of white nationalism and that Asians were not wanted. After Chagar's murder, the youth of Southall organized their own self-defense. The police were questioned by the community, but the police made it clear that they did not value South Asian lives. In fact, they even arrested 2 youths who were protesting the lack of investigation by the police.
The only credit I can give to the Indian Workers Association is that they have been responsible for the formation of Southall Youth Movement. It's their inability to deal with the situation. Here to stay, here to fight.
The next day, the Southall Youth Movement was formed. Word travelled all across the UK about a rising militancy in Southall. And just a few months later, the Indian Progressive Youth Movement was also formed in Bradford, which later reformed as the Asian Youth Movement. Because remember, it does not matter to white supremacists with a gun what flavour of brown you are. You're either black or a weapon used against black people in a Western state. 3 years after NF held that election meeting in Bradford, they held another one in Southall. They could once again use a highly televised election meeting to intimidate the South Asian folks in the area and provide some kind of validation to the white workers who were feeling the pinch of the economy.
We have got to institute a swift and immediate program of humane repatriation of all coloured immigrants, their descendants and their dependents, since the passing of the British Nationality Act in 1948. Including those born here? Absolutely, yes. Including those born here. The fact that they are born here doesn't make them British. But if they don't accept that, they will be compelled to go.
It was an insult to say to us that we should go. You know, we might have had origins in other countries, but this was our home.
NF showed up with a heavily militarized police presence, but also flanked by openly fascist white nationalists. And I'm not just saying this. See for yourselves. These people walked into the community with police protection. Black and brown people in the area could not let this fly, so they took to the streets. They protested and raised their voices against the demonization, the active and intentional demonization of their community, both by the people around them who allowed this to happen and the state. They were met with brutal police violence. This event made it clear to even those who were in denial that this was an intentional campaign by the state. Many people realized that this was not a case of bumbling police officers who were unprepared to protect their communities, but rather this was the reality of state violence against people who were deemed the other. Over 1,000 people were injured, more than 700 were arrested, and of that, about 342 people were charged with a criminal offense. A white schoolteacher from New Zealand, Blair Peach, who was an active member of the Anti-Nazi League, was killed by the police. Thousands from the community marched where he was killed. Clarence Brown, who was a community organizer in Southall and a member of the band Misty and Roots, was left in a coma for 5 months.
My family is a mixture of Indian and African. Grew up in Southall and formed a musician cooperative called People Unite. A lot of young people who had talents came in, would teach the young people to play music. People Unite. I remember quite clearly taking a megaphone and asking people to be peaceful and to be quiet and do not be provoked by the police. As I was on the megaphone, the police rushed us on horseback and with shields. And of course, many people ran into the People Unite Center for cover. We allowed them in thinking they'd be safe. The police followed them in. I remember standing in the passageway, and I remember these police officers coming towards me saying, "Get that black he is a leader." They beat me. Next thing I was unconscious.
We heard that Clarence Baker had been seriously injured. We were very concerned about that.
I had a fractured skull and blood clot on my brain.
Now, there's no denying that Blair Peach, being a white schoolteacher, had an impact on how the British media and white police officers reacted to questions about the case. Questions about black and brown deaths had been previously met with arrests, which were constantly ignored by the media. But the London police could not run from this situation. An internal investigation was launched to find out what had happened.
If any officer in the Metropolitan Police, Special Patrol Group officer or whoever, abuses his power, he will be dealt with.
But you know, if you don't get into trouble, you won't come into confrontation with the police.
And it was only in 2010 when they finally released a report stating that Blair Peach was in fact killed by the police. More specifically, a member of the SPG, the Special Patrol Group, because only they had access to the quote-unquote unauthorized weapons like lead cautious and specific police radios. The investigation did find that Blair Peach had his skull crushed in by a police radio. But as things usually go, the pigs covered for each other and no one specific was actually held accountable.
What do you think the effect of the death of Blair Peach has been?
It's a good thing that there's one less imported alien Marxist agitator causing trouble in this country. And the press try to put across this Blair Peach as some dear, sweet, idealistic person. And if you look at photographs of him, you'll see that he was racial chaos anyhow.
Throughout the 80s, there were rising attacks on African, Caribbean, and South Asian families in the UK. In March of 1981, a suspicious fire broke out at the birthday party of a 16-year-old Caribbean teenager, which led to the death of 13 children. The community, who had at that point been familiar with the use of firebombs by skinheads, knew that this was the work, but this was never taken seriously by the police. There were no condolences sent by the Queen or the Prime Minister. No one cared. And in July of that same year, Parveen Khan and her 3 children also died in a fire. During the early hours of July the 2nd, the Khan family were fast asleep. Petrol was poured through their letterbox and set alight, setting ablaze to the entire home. The fire killed Parveen and her 3 children, Aska, Kamran and Imran. The only survivor was the father, Yunus Khan, who survived by throwing himself off the top floor. He was then hospitalized for serious burns. The police, being the police, then tried to pin the entire incident on the sole survivor.
But we had no evidence to show that this was a white on Asian attack. The only person who escaped, strangely, was her husband. We had an awful lot of domestic murders. A husband would indicate that he couldn't stand his wife anymore, for example. And then the first thinking when you get a new type of crime is, who does this sort of thing? Prior to that, I'd heard of honour killings. Honour killing is something which is well known in Asia, where it's either accepted or understood that if things get bad, that's what you do. You get rid of everybody.
With Sherlock over here trying to say that it was an honor killing. And he believes that to this day. So while the only surviving member of that family was at the hospital, covered in bandages, suffering from serious burns, and the death of his entire family, the police were engaged in cooking up a story about how Mr. Yunus had actually walked down the stairs, set the letterbox alight himself, and then ran back upstairs and then threw himself out of the window intentionally. The threat of being burned alive like this was a very real one for some time for non-white folks in the UK. Active violence against the communities in neighborhoods like these further solidified the need for young folks from the communities to organize their own self-defense. And of course, British media would always paint these efforts as forms of extremism or violent rioters. During this time, the skinheads and other white nationalist movements were gaining a lot of steam among young white men, partly due to the fact that racism had been mainstreamed and accepted. Edgelord punk bands like the Foreskins, The Business, and The Last Resort grew a massive following during this time. Many of these guys leaned into the edgy rhetoric and flirted with a lot of fascists at the time. They decided to hold a gig at the Hambrough tavern in Southall. They did this to lean into that edgy kind of status that they had accrued over time, and perhaps wanted to intimidate the community or at least earn brownie points from their edgy fanboys, which of course is a motive they denied while using racial slurs as well.
Went a bit mad, didn't they? Just went over the top.
But they were provoked, weren't they?
Who provoked them? We didn't.
Okay, Gary, let's read some of the lyrics from one of your songs. We've been warned of rivers of blood, see the trickle before the flood. That's a reference to Enoch Powell. When they say trickle, they're talking about immigration. These dudes leaned into it because it didn't affect them, and they would get edgy brownie points. Now let's skim some comments. Mind you, this isn't on their main channel, because on their main channel, I think their comments are disabled. I just pulled up the first repost video I could find, and these are some of the comments. First bought this record when I was a teen and has gotten more and more true ever since. So many people don't realize what this song is about. Many members of the Foreskins were members of the British movement, and one even went to join Screwdriver. You say that like it's a bad thing. By the way, I'm not just being a hater because I don't get punk or hardcore music. In fact, I've actually been in the scene. I've been in those spaces as one of the few South Asian performers where I was, in a predominantly white space. I know what the energy is like. I have first-hand experience. Large groups of Nazis arrived at the tavern and terrorized the residents. They broke shop windows, abused a local shop owner. They did their Nazi salutes and treated it like it was some kind of demonstration of the power bestowed upon them by the society at large, who frankly did not see much of a problem with it. The society at large tended to brush these things off as just a bunch of men just having a bit of fun. Some of them unfurled a banner under a bridge nearby and passed out leaflets talking about mass deportation, calling it a crusade. But the community was already on high alert, having lost friends, neighbors, and loved ones to burnings and stabbings. For the umpteenth time, the residents took to the streets and marched in protest to face these head-on. The local police had heard that the gig would be happening, and they quickly formed a police cordon outside the pub. The residents argued with the police, saying that it was the fascists who were in the wrong. They showed them the property that was damaged. Some of the people who were harassed on the streets came forward. Mohan Singh, a witness, even told the police that he could identify who had smashed the shops, and agreed to work with the police to go into the pub and point the person out. But the cops responded by telling him to buy a beer, go home and watch it on the TV. After more reinforcements showed up with the special patrol group, the police brought out the truncheons and riot shields and began to forcefully disperse the South Asians in the area. It was clear once more who they were trying to protect. The Southall residents had had enough. They retaliated by throwing anything they could get their hands on at behind the cops, including bottles and the fascists came out of the pub and began throwing back their own projectiles. And eventually, the pub was burned down. Nazis had to flee.
What we've done is we've defended our community from, skinheads from outside went on the rampage. They beat up our women and smashed up our shops.
We protect ourselves. The police didn't help us, right? Yeah? So we defend ourselves.
Because in view of the kind of racial harassment of blacks in Southall, nothing is being done.
They don't want to know. They don't want to know anything.
Where Southall will explode tomorrow. I think people need to distinguish these things.
The police arrested 25 South Asians and 5 fascists. This form of resistance sent a clear message to the pubs in the area that the community would not be afraid to defend itself. Other black and brown communities in other cities also began to prepare to defend themselves. On July 11, 1981, members of the United Black Youth League in Bradford caught wind that a similar gig or march was going to happen in Bradford. Given the numerous amounts of times it had already happened and the incident in Southall just recently, the youth decided to make in advance, something the movement in Bradford had not done before that. Luckily, the march actually didn't take place and the fascists didn't show up at all, so the youth actually didn't have to use them. However, the cops found out about the and arrested 12 youths from the area.
You know, what you were going to do with them, you were going to burn the shops down, you were going to do this. No, we weren't going to do any of that. We never denied making them. It was why.
They were South Asian young men from various backgrounds, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh and Christian. And they became known as the Bradford 12. They were put on trial for conspiracy to cause explosions and endanger lives, and were faced with life in prison if found guilty. The Bradford 12 and their supporters argued that they were forced to defend themselves and the police would just refuse to do so. They made the case that the police would harass the communities when they called for help instead of defending them. During the trial, evidence was given in court that implicated a local detective, Inspector Holland, who had said in its statement that there was no such thing as racial violence, but then immediately afterwards saying that police officers needed to be prejudiced and needed to be racist in order to do their jobs. The media at the time were busy printing headlines like "Black Gang and Plot to Police." Because of the support of thousands of people and active community organizing and very good lawyers, the Bradford 12 were eventually acquitted in a massive win for anti-racist action and self-defense in the UK.
We don't make discriminately. I mean, if people feel in a particular situation that they have to defend their community, then that we defend.
I'm not interested in trying to convince people who are racist or give a pass to racism that racism exists and should be taken seriously. I'm not interested in doing that. The information you need is literally at your fingertips, but many people often choose hatred because it is easy, it stirs emotions. Some do it for political or monetary gain, others choose hatred because they are frustrated with their material realities, which then makes them easy marks for politicians so they can farm votes. And there are others who just genuinely believe that monolithizing entire groups of people, stripping them of their humanity and identities is completely a-okay. And if that's you, that's a you problem. But if you're here to educate yourself better on these issues and you're trying to grapple with your own biases like we all are, then we welcome you. I'm more interested in providing a connection point, if you will, for people who have had similar experiences, other South Asian folks and other minorities, just so we can learn about each other's cultures a bit more and build some kind of solidarity. Instead of having friends we know or family members be so easily swayed with reactionary talking points and staying divided based on lines drawn on a map by our colonizers. In the next video, we will take an even further step back in history and look at how this kind of targeted hatred towards people of South Asian descent is not new. It has disturbing parallels that stretch 1,000 years in Europe. We will talk about the history of our Romani cousins. Until next time.